I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. The Montgomery County Circuit Courthouse is an enormous structure befitting an enormous county and sits at the south end of downtown Rockville. Most circuit court business is family matters, disputes between people or with the government, local criminal trials. But every now and then, a court case appears in these courts that has big reverberations. In December 2023, there was a jury trial of a disability discrimination case against one of the largest medical science philanthropies in the world, the Chevy Chase-based Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which has an $11 billion endowment and employs several Nobel Prize winners. The lawsuit was brought by a research scientist formerly employed by the organization. Her name is Vivian Chung, who claimed that she was wrongfully rejected for renewal of her research contract. Chung is a pediatric neurologist whose work looks at RNA as opposed to DNA biology in order to study neurological disorders, particularly a version of ALS called ALS4. The case is unique because it tested the concept of disability discrimination and raised questions about the meaning of scientific rigor, the use of peer review in the scientific setting, and how elite organizations driven by the pursuit of excellence struggle with the notion of accommodations. If you want to imagine how big this was, think about the public debate surrounding diversity and merit in elite institutions that has already felled two major Ivy League presidents. I spoke with Vivian Chung after the trial about how all of this came to pass. I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are dirty, messy, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode has a long story. In 2022, Congress passed a new law called the Music Modernization Act, which removed copyright protection from artistic works more than 100 years ago on a rolling basis. In 2022, that brought Winnie the Pooh and the Great Gatsby into the public domain. In 2023, there was a technical legal hiatus, but January 2024 has brought all recordings from 1923 into the public domain. You can download, remix, and reuse them freely. There are exceptions. Only recordings made in 1923 are in the public domain. Not a later 1932 recording of a song, for example, which will only be available in the public domain in 2033. We cleaned up the recordings as best as we could. If you want to know more about public domain and artistic works, go to Duke University's Center for the Study of the Public Domain. This is a 1923 song called Wolverine Blues. by the Benson Orchestra of Chicago. In the news this week, as respiratory disease hospitalizations grow, Johns Hopkins Medicine, one of the largest service providers in the Washington, D.C. region, has issued mandatory masking order in its patient care areas in all its Maryland facilities. Earlier, on December 28th, the Maryland Department of Health had issued its own guidance on masking, or source control, as it is known in technical parlance, for patient care areas. And Maryland's EMS medical doctor had issued similar masking guidance to EMS providers in the state. Respiratory illness hospitalizations, which include COVID, the flu, among others, was over 11 per 100,000 population in the last days of 2023. That number went up to 16.7 last week and is now reported to be 8.1. These numbers are the latest available, but reporting does lag and the numbers may be revised. The Maryland Department of Health says that a respiratory virus infection rate of less than 5 per 100,000 is baseline. From 5 to under 10 is an elevated zone, and over 10 is a red or danger zone. If you are in congregate settings with lots of people indoors together, masking might be a good option right about now. January 10th started the 446th session of the Maryland General Assembly. January 17th, Governor Wes Moore presents his capital and operating budgets, and February 7th, he delivers the State of the State address. Because there is single-party rule in Annapolis now, legislative leaders are very much looking at what Governor Moore has to say. But the governor generally has been reticent about taking policy positions ahead of time. Outside the $3.3 billion in transportation cuts and looking at $761 million in budget deficit, we don't know what exactly the governor wants. On the revenue side, legislative leaders are saying everything is on the table, but not going further than that without announcements from the governor. On January 9th, ahead of the session, the governor wrote an op-ed in the Capital Gazette from Annapolis with his housing secretary, Jake Day, on the importance of increasing housing supply in the state, a key issue in revitalizing the state economy, according to them. The op-ed identified areas where reform was needed, but did not offer any specific solutions, just the promise of coming legislation. However, there has been a memo from the governor's office circulating among housing activists that contains more specifics. Among them, density bonuses for transit-oriented development projects within a mile of rail stations that include 25% affordable housing. Nonprofit housing developers offering 50% affordable units also get a density bonus. The memo opens the door to some general upzoning, for example, missing middle housing in single-family housing zoning, and greater density in mixed-use areas. The memo is proposing limiting local adequate public facilities ordinances, also called APFO, which is used by counties and municipalities to limit new construction when schools and roads are inadequate to support development. The proposal is for projects using low-income housing tax credits to be able to bypass APFO rules. There are further provisions to allow manufactured homes, normally limited to mobile home zoning, to be installed in single-family home zoning areas. There are rental rules reducing security deposit, limiting evictions during bad weather or public emergencies. Some renters will also have first right of refusal if landlords are selling property. Lastly, they want to set up the Maryland Community Investment Corporation to be funded by the federal new market tax credits that are used to stimulate community development. Even in their skeletal form, the proposals have created quite a stir. Housing Secretary Jake Day clarified on Twitter that while overall supply was a concern, the administration had modeled extensively and found that the affordability crisis does not improve even with major additions of market rate supply of housing. This is contrary to existing public policy research that shows that housing is in short supply market-wide, and any addition, including at the higher end of the market, brings price stability across the whole market. There are now calls for the administration to share their modeling. We have had a standing invitation to Secretary Day to join the podcast for several weeks now, and hopefully he'll take the opportunity to explain further. I imagine he finds himself constrained as the administration pushes its housing package through the Assembly, and he is being cautious. Meanwhile, in Montgomery County, the County Inspector General, which has been looking into the Beidelman sexual harassment scandal in the Montgomery County Public Schools, released a report based on what appears to be a counter-complaint that alleged other MCPS supervisors behaved in inappropriate ways as well. The Inspector General's report concluded that they were unable to substantiate the specific complaints, but also were not able to get clear answers to their questions from MCPS officials. The Inspector General has recommended that MCPS institute a new policy that requires supervisors to disclose prior romantic relationships with their subordinates and monitoring of the supervisor's work related to the person concerned. Current MCPS policy requires disclosure of ongoing relationships alone, not old ones. The Montgomery County Inspector General is expected to release another report on MCPS's process and policy for dealing with sexual harassment complaints. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with pediatric neurologist and RNA researcher Vivian Chung, who filed a discrimination lawsuit against her former employer, Chevy Chase-based Howard Hughes Medical Institute, in Montgomery County courts. This next song from 1923 is Moonshine Blues by Ma Rainey. Vivian Chung, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you for having me.
You are a pediatric neurologist who conducted genetic research with funding from Howard Hughes Medical Institute, one of the world's largest bioscience philanthropies based in Chevy Chase. But in December 2023, you were in Montgomery County Circuit Court in front of a jury arguing that Howard Hughes discriminated against you. What happened?
I started working for Howard Hughes Medical Institute in 2008, and I sued the institute for discriminating against me at the time of my contract renewal. In Howard Hughes Medical Institute, my position is as an investigator, and I came up for my contract renewal. At that time, there were two Asian American women and eight white male who came up for the renewal. Both of us, as Asian women, did not get renewed, and seven out of the eight men were renewed. Right before my renewal, I also had a medical accident. In the middle of a medical procedure, I suffered a spinal cord injury, and that required the use of a wheelchair. And I believe that HHMI thought that because of my disability, I was no longer qualified to be their investigator, and which is, in my mind, so far from the truth. In the last 5 years of my time in HHMI, we made a lot of progress in both in the basic science research as well as in medical research.
HHMI refers to Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Being a Howard Hughes investigator is the absolute national and international top tier of scientific research. And your lab, I believe, is at the University of Michigan. So, why are you in Montgomery County courts?
Yes. So the HHMI has a model where the headquarters is in Montgomery County in Chevy Chase. But we all work at different universities around the country. But the headquarters is in Montgomery County. I also spend most of my time in Montgomery County because I have a collaboration with the NIH on a clinical project.
NIH being the National Institutes of Health, which is in Bethesda.
Correct.
You said you were hired by Howard Hughes Medical Institute in 2008. What were you hired to do? What exactly is your research?
Yes. So I was hired into HHMI through a physician scientist competition. At that time, they were looking to recruit doctors that do research as their investigator. My research at that time involved looking for what control the expression of genes. Prior to my work, people used to think of or look for regulator one gene at a time. And we devised a genetic method that allowed us to look for the regulator of thousands of genes at a time. And many of those regulators, when they are not working, contribute to different human diseases. So I was looking at gene expression and their relationship to human diseases.
Later on, your research moved to more RNA biology. What changed?
Yes, I think so. At the time when we were looking at the regulator, we were looking at DNA sequence differences in the regulator that makes some people gene express higher, other express the genes lower. And so that was at the DNA level, where at the gene expression level is the RNA. So how many copy of each gene was made at the RNA level? And around 2008, 2009, technology became available that we can sequence both the DNA and a copy of the RNA called the cDNA. And we were learning about the technology. So we took cells, extract DNA, extract RNA, and sequenced them. And of course, the textbook for many, many years told us that RNA is an exact copy of DNA. And when we compared those two sequences, we were really surprised to find many more differences in the RNA sequence compared to the corresponding DNA. And so we published that finding and then spent the next several years trying to understand that phenomenon.
Could you lay out the difference, the basic difference between DNA and RNA? In fact, I believe there is an entire line of research in your field called DNA RNA difference.
So we coined that term when we first realized that the RNA sequence were different from the DNA, and we didn't really understand what they were. So we just coined it with a very descriptive terms, DNA, RNA differences. So DNA is our genetic code. And so if we think of a person within you, all your cells have exactly the same DNA sequences. But your nerve cells is different from your heart cells, it's different from your kidney cells because they have different RNA. And we used to think that the RNA is just expressing the genes at the DNA sequences by different number of copies. And that those copy number differences in genes is what we call gene expression. We thought that the differences between the cell type is conferred by those copy number or gene expression differences. And what our work showed is that it's much more complicated than that. That in the past, when the DNA is made, the RNA is made from the DNA in a process called transcription, it used to think that copying process was identical. It is still true, it is identical, but the RNA are then very quickly modified to now we have found more than 150 different decorations on those RNA. And those RNA decorations, or in scientific term, the chemical modifications, are incredibly important in conferring cell identity and function.
What would be an example, or a couple of examples maybe, of the manifestation of that difference in for those of us that are not biologists?
Yeah, so perhaps the one that is where many people would know is the mRNA vaccines. So it turns out the mRNA vaccine that have the identical copy to just made out of 4 letters, same as the DNA, did not work. It causes cells to have to activate an immune system and destroy the vaccine. Whereas the vaccine that is in use from Moderna and Pfizer and other companies have one of these decorations on the use. And from that, we know that our cells need to see these decorated RNA rather than a naked RNA. And another fun example is octopus. So in octopus that go from very cold weather or very cold water to a warmer water, in order for one of their potassium channel to work, that potassium channel, in order to adapt to the change in temperature in the water, have to be modified. One of the RNA on this potassium channel has to be modified in order for the channel to work and allow the octopus to function properly.
Right. And you were doing this research, and it's about 2010, and you go into your first review, contract renewal that happens, about year 4, year 5 of your contract. What happens then?
Yeah, so I presented my work in the more regular genetics work of finding regulator for genes, and also told the HHMI and the review panel that we made this surprising discovery that we think that RNA may not be identical to the DNA. And it was really an observation at that time, and we did not know why. But with that observation, they renewed my contract.
Okay, so the fact that you found RNA DNA difference led them to renew your contract in 2012.
Correct. Yes.
At that time, where was your lab?
My lab at that time was at the University of Pennsylvania.
Thereafter, you moved your lab.
Correct. I moved from Penn to Michigan.
Why did you move?
Actually, in 2009, my husband died suddenly. And we worked together. We started as collaborators. So everything at Penn just reminded me of him. And I thought a change in scenery would be a good thing. So I moved to Michigan.
Did you remain in Michigan?
So we moved in 2013. At that time, in a year later, as we were in the process of trying to understand how the RNA become different from the DNA, we identified the timing during that copying process of making RNA from DNA of when the RNA become different and a nucleic acid structure that is necessary for those differences to occur. It's called an R loop. But at that time, no one knew what was the function of R loop. So we had to go figure out what the R loops do. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that there are patients with genetic mutations that affect their R loops. So we thought that would be a good patients to study to understand those R loops. And the patients are at the National Institute of Health. So I came to the NIH for a sabbatical to understand the R loop structure, to meet the patients and recruit them into a research project.
And you stayed here at the NIH and in Maryland, right?
Yes and no. So I continued to commute back and forth to my lab in Michigan. But since at the beginning I was here for a sabbatical, and it turns out that the patients are children and then who have a motor neuron disease. So it's a childhood onset ALS. And to make a very long story short, they had been the subject of another research project. And while that project was successfully identify the genetic mutation that caused the disease, no one continued to study their disease. So they were sort of abandoned in that sense until we restarted a research project at the NIH. So I felt that I had to continue working with them to understand the disease. So I commuted between Michigan and the NIH.
Maybe explain what the scientific relationship was between your NIH work and your lab in Michigan.
So the NIH project is a clinical project. We recruited patients with these R loop defects into the clinical center, study the disease process, and we also study cells from the patients, and those cells are studied at my lab in Michigan to understand the RNA profile, how the R loop forms, and what are the effects of those R loop defects on gene expression on cells. The NIH project is to map out the progression of the disease so that when we have a treatment, we can say that that progression has changed as a result of the treatment.
Do you think that Howard Hughes at that point may have thought that you were more interested in clinical work at NIH rather than in your lab work at Michigan?
Well, I don't know what they thought, but at that time, we were still doing very intense basic science research in my lab at Michigan. And the clinical project at the NIH was really a way for us to understand how these RNA processes affect human cells. So I'm not sure that they were concerned that the work was too clinically focused, but of course, I don't know what they were thinking.
And while all of this is going on, you'll end up in a wheelchair. How did it play out?
Yeah, so during the time as I was spending my sabbatical at the NIH, I also found out that I have a genetic disorder. And the genetic mutation was identified through a program at the NIH. And it turns out that it's a very rare disease that no one really understood. And part of the component of the disease is a hard to control blood pressure problem. So in order to better understand the blood pressure issues, I went through a medical procedure. and during which someone dropped my blood pressure accidentally by too much. I ended up having a spinal cord injury from that.
How is your work affected by that injury?
As a neurologist, I did find out that it was much harder to use a wheelchair than I had ever imagined. But I continue my work in the lab, both at Michigan and the clinical project at the NIH. I would say continue without changing a beat. So
your argument in your court case has been that since that disability, Howard Hughes Medical Institute began to look at you differently.
yes, and I think that was very clear. And so at the time when I ended up after the spinal cord injury and became a first-time wheelchair user, I approached HHMI to ask them for accommodations. I asked if they would allow me to use part of the budget that they have already given me to hire a part-time assistant to help me get used to traveling in a wheelchair. And that quickly escalated to a list of very invasive questions that they asked me to fill out, and a meeting with the head of HR, the general counsel, and the vice president of HHMI. Knowing the severity of how they took the issue, I withdrew my accommodation request. But they persisted with all their questions and such. A few of the scientific officers at HHMI that I had a very close relationship with, that I talked a lot of science with and such, also changed in terms of their attitude towards me.
And this affected your contract renewal in 2018.
Yes. So prior to the 2018 renewal, they actually asked me to retire medically. Their medical retirement, on one hand, provide a 5-year funding for me and then also for my research group. But at the same time, I have to agree that my medical problem was so severe that throughout those 5-year period, I will wind down my scientific career, which I don't see a reason for, and I did not accept their offer. And when I went up for renewal, they did not renew me.
You have also said that the renewal process was stacked against you. Could you explain that?
Yeah. So one of the scientific officer urged me to retire, and like up to basically 2 months before the renewal process, they were urging me to retire. And then they also told one of the reviewer, my primary reviewer, that I was considering a medical retirement. So in my sense, that he was already contaminated. And the HHMI renewal process is really quite different from the general peer review process in science. The reviewers for HHMI are drawn from 2 internal panels. So even though these are scientists that do not work for HHMI, they are on advisory panels of HHMI. And as you said, HHMI is a very well-known and one of the largest and prestigious organizations. So many people like to be, it's a prestigious position to be on the advisory panel. So the reviewers are drawn from 2 advisory panels. They all have been there for a very long time, many of them for more than 15 years, some of them even 20 years. So they know the organization well, they have a long history, they are paid very generously for their review. So in so many ways, they are different from kind of an independent peer review system. And on top of all this, one of my reviewer was told that I was having medical issues and they retired from that.
So in 2018, they decided not to renew your contract, and then you had to close out the project. You ended employment in 2020 then?
Yeah, so HHMI has a process of like a 2-year wind down, even though someone did not get renewed. So I left HHMI at the end of October 2020.
But your lab still continues.
Correct. I was able to find funding from the NIH and a private foundation.
What about your work at the NIH? Are you still continuing that?
Yes, so I'm still continuing that project, and we're actually have made quite a bit of progress. We're testing several treatments in the laboratory for the patients. And so, yes, those work are continuing.
Right. And on the RNA biology side at your lab, what is the progress you've made in the last few years?
Yeah, so we really now know that the sequence is really different from the DNA, but we don't know exactly where the decorations are and how the RNA are being modified. So now we know how important the RNA is, since we just went through a pandemic of a virus who have an RNA genome, unlike us, right? So we have DNA in our cells. The SARS-CoV-2 genome is made of RNA. And we now also know that there are mRNA vaccines and treatments with RNA medicine probably are going to be more effective and cheaper than traditional medicine. So as a result, I have been working with colleagues to build a human RNome project. So very similar to the Human Genome Project to sequence the DNA of human cells, the Human RNome Project hopefully will sequence the RNA of human cells.
You are still employed by the University of Michigan?
I am. So I changed my employment from HHMI to University of Michigan.
I was in the courtroom during your case. And what struck me was that the attorney for Howard Hughes called Howard Hughes Medical Institute the Olympics of medical science research. That is the highest level of medical science research. If you call something the Olympics, there is a natural question that follows: is in the Olympics, is any accommodation feasible? Can we even think of accommodating somebody for whatever reason, whether it's a spinal cord injury, or it's wheelchair use, or it's some mental health issue, anything? In the Olympics, there are no accommodations. So, what does your case, from your point of view, say about how accommodations are made in elite science?
Yeah, I think that's really one of the major reasons that I want to bring the case forward and to make this case public. Because between 21 to 25% of the US population has a disability. And this issue of accommodation or disclosure comes up all the time from students, from faculty, about whether it is, quote, safe to disclose that they have a disability or needed accommodations. And I would disagree with the attorneys of HHMI to call science, any science, an Olympics, right? Because this is our job as leaders in science, is to make sure that anyone and everyone has the ability to do science and contribute to science in their best way. And oftentimes it is to provide them with accommodations. So I think for me to have to struggle so much and to a point where I have to lose my job in asking for accommodation is a major issue that we as a scientific community and more larger as a general community need to address.
Consider also all this, the controversy over diversity and inclusion of late. There seems to be a sense that introducing the idea of accommodation in that rarefied environment seems highly problematic and subject to the idea that we are not somehow recognizing merit.
Yep. Yes. And I think, and as you said, right, we've heard that throughout the entire trial, that HHMI on one side kept talking about merit in terms of membership into honor society, awards such as the Nobel Prize, and so on. I am in complete agreement with them that those are important milestones in one's career as a scientist. But at the same time, I think that our science have to have meaning, that our science have to reach people, that merit, in my mind, of affecting the life of a few people or hundreds of people or millions of people matters. And so I don't think that we're somehow contaminating science by thinking about applications, especially in biological sciences, when that line between people who need health as patients and the scientific discovery should be hands in hand. And I think to divorce those two things, we are not answering to the need of a large part of our populations.
You know, in 2023, the place of mRNA research or RNA research is fairly secure following the making of the mRNA vaccine. But, you know, Caitlin Carrico's story at Penn,
I was going to say,
right?
yes.
Where she worked on RNA biology and then was demoted in the 2010s, only to be recognized after her work was used to make the mRNA vaccine, suggests that RNA biology as a subdiscipline in genetics seems to have gotten, at least, you know, prior to the pandemic. Your contract renewal case came up prior in 2018, so before the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, this place that RNA biology held in genetic research seems somewhat vulnerable, to say the least, if not lower, right?
Yes. I think part of the problem is that RNA is highly dynamic. And in science, it's easier to have a set of rules, and that the molecules follows a set of rules. And RNA changes all the time within the cells in response to the cellular need. So it's not as clean in that sense because it is so dynamic. And, you know, until I guess the community is forced to face this dynamic issue of a biological process that change very quickly, it's very hard to embrace it as a field.
Well, genetic research, genes, has the sense of permanence, right? You have the genes when you're born in the embryo, and then you have them for the rest of your life, right? That's a very different kind of sort of mindset than what you're just describing about RNA biology, which is, you know, you call it dynamic, but also, you know, very transient.
That is biology itself, right? Like, I think the time that we think of a cell, it's like a parts list and a very simple set of diagrams in a textbook has advanced. We are now at a point where we have to understand the transience or the dynamic nature of biology in order to understand when it goes wrong, how it went wrong. Because if we don't look at that dynamic nature, oftentimes what has changed is not just the rule books, right? It's the pattern in which it responds to different cellular environment or different needs of a cell. So I think we are entering a time of understanding biology in a different dynamic range. Right?
Given all of this sort of idea of how knowledge about RNA, about DNA is different, let's talk a little bit about the panel that reviewed you. Could it be said that the panel was more familiar with the permanence of the DNA problem rather than the impermanence of the RNA problem?
I think if we just do the most fundamental thing, right? Like put the word RNA into the reviewer's CV or their research statements. For most of them, you don't see the word RNA at all, but you do see the word DNA. So on one hand, they were saying that the effect size of our finding is smaller than they expect.
But who expects? Who expects?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what is the standard, right? There are no such standard. When we say that the patients have fewer R loops than their family members without the mutations. And so their genome-wide across the entire cell, they have 40% less R loops. In the mind of an RNA biologist, that is huge.
In evaluating your work, Howard Hughes uses a peer review model.
What they call the peer review model, yes.
Right. I mean, at least intended to be a peer review model. So, what is the model they used?
Yeah, I think it really is very different. So the committee, the review panel, have been the same group of people for a decade or two. So in a small group like that, and they think that it's an elite group, it's very easy to have groupthink.
But Vivian, the panel consists of very prominent scientists. These are not people that are seen as kowtowing even to elite institutions. The entire peer review system is based on this kind of gatekeeping function. And you're saying that this gatekeeping is not possible?
I'm not saying that the gatekeeping process doesn't work, but what I'm saying is that we cannot put in gates that have been there for a long time and in such a small elite group so that they begin to have group things and to be too conservative to think of a broader view. So, for example, peer review of journals, right? The reviewers do not belong to a small group. They are just drawn based on topics. And reviewer of grants from NIH and other groups, at least it's a larger group, right? Than the same 15 people who have been friends for 20 years.
Is that a function of how rarefied your field is, in a sense that, there are so few people that are working in that field, in that area, that it is really not possible to be anonymous, even if you were not to disclose their names, you would know who, has written what.
I don't think so. So the NIH peer review system, at least the applicants don't know who the reviewers are.
Now, you've been associated with several elite institutions, University of Michigan, University of Pennsylvania, I believe the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Do you see similar problems more broadly beyond Howard Hughes? Or do you think these are issues, very narrowly about the organization of Howard Hughes itself?
I think there, of course, the idea of marginalized individuals, right? Women of color, people with disabilities have a harder time in general moving up the career ladder. But in a place that is at that such top level, such as the HHMI, in such a small organization, this type of problems can intensify. In my personal experience, it did.
Vivian Chung, thank you for taking the time to explain your case.
Thank you.
Tell me, pretty daddy, what's the matter now? Are you trying to quit me and you don't know how?
That's Ida Cox and her blues serenaders from 1923 with Lordy Lordy Blues. Vivian Chung lost her case in front of the Montgomery County jury last month in December. Her lawyers have filed a motion for a new trial. While elite institutions say they are focused on excellence, any whiff of accommodation or redistribution, as economists would call it, is seen as antithetical to the pursuit of excellence. But the real question is how we define excellence in the first place. And how do we measure it? In science and research generally, peer review is the instrument of choice. There is also no denying that peer reviewers are not autonomous humans free from sociology. The history of science is littered with examples of ignored brilliance and successful mediocrity that was sustained sociologically via networks, relationships, conventional but faulty wisdom. Let's not forget the suboptimal design of the QWERTY keyboard. If you want a modern day example, look at what startups are funded and why. How Elizabeth Holmes perpetrated a colossal fraud by promising a new way to do blood tests, and how Caitlin Carrico was sidelined for her mRNA work by elite institutions only to meet their comeuppance during the COVID pandemic. Truth is, we cannot really do away with the sociological structure of science, no matter how much we believe that we can and are doing so. Better simply to accept the reality and design systems to mitigate. One way to mitigate sociological impact on the evaluation of scientific progress is through anonymous peer reviews, which is standard practice across science and the academy. But Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which its attorney described in court as the Olympics and the Navy SEALs of medical science research, does not follow this model. Not only are their peer reviews not anonymous, but Howard Hughes exercises a great degree of control over the process. By paying the review panel well, having an internal employee scientific research officer coordinate the review, and it turns out reviewing the reviewers themselves. Further, the members of the review panel have had long association with the Institute and each other, and may themselves have received Howard Hughes funding. To the jury in December, the HHMI peer review may have looked like democracy did to Winston Churchill. A bad system, but one without a better. No one likes to believe that they were selected in their jobs or a grant or in a school or in another competitive endeavor as a result of accommodation. We all earned it. So, highlighting the importance of accommodation in an abstract pursuit of excellence is a proposition that is difficult to accept. It requires us to look into our souls. Ask the question, did we get what we got because of the sheer brilliance of our minds, or through some constellation of sociological factors? Vivian Chung's case clearly raises large questions about how scientific research is done, recognized, evaluated, and supported, what the peer review process is and should be, and even about the place of RNA biology in the study of genetics. But her case also speaks to the diversity versus merit debate we are embroiled in right now. Vivian Chung represents the best case for accommodations. She was already an elite scientist before she needed accommodation. And she asked for medical accommodation, perhaps the most sympathetic form of accommodation there is. She claims she continued to produce important work through the period of her disability. But Howard Hughes counters that her rejection was entirely about the quality of her work and had nothing to do with accommodations or her medical condition. Howard Hughes claimed that, in fact, they had accommodated Vivian Chung. Despite their disagreement, what is common to both sides is that neither makes a causal connection between the importance of the accommodation and her work. And this is the estrangement that needs to be addressed if we want to come to terms with the struggle over accommodations and diversity in elite institutions. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, and assistant producers Daniel Gallio and Katarina Gasek, with support from University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics and government and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from 1923. Sound recordings from that year entered the public domain on January 1st, 2024. You can listen to old American tunes from the National Jukebox collection of the Library of Congress. We are going out with Walter Donaldson and Gus Kahn with Making Whoopee. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
Another year, or maybe less. What's this I hear? Well, can't you guess? She feels neglected, and he's suspected of making whoopee. She sits alone most every night. He doesn't phone, he doesn't write. He says he's busy, but she says, is he? He's making whoopee. He doesn't make much money, only 5,000 a per. Some judge who thinks he's funny says you pay 6 to her. He says, now judge, suppose I fail. The judge says, budge, right into jail. You better keep her, you'll find it cheaper than making